Hello, everyone. Today we are going to introduce advanced biology, ecology. And we have a hierarchy of ecology that goes from population to community to ecosystem to biome to biosphere. And we're going to start off at the lowest level, and those are at the population, that is at the population level. So, first of all, when we go into a city or a town, we see the green sign, and underneath there it says population of whatever that town is. And what that number stands for is the number of humans that live in or within that city's limits since the last census. And so a population, by definition, is it's the number of a certain species living in a certain place at a certain time. And there are a lot of factors that can go into that. If you think about your town, is the population the same from school year to summer? Is it the same from 6 a.m. to 4 p.m.? Those things can change. When we talk about biological populations, they also can change, but they might just not move around as much as what we as humans do freely since we have vehicles and other types of transportation. So we're going to talk about what makes a population grow. So first of all, early scientists thought that population could go on and on and on and on forever. We know that that's not the case because populations depend on certain things in the environment, those needs, food, water, space, and shelter. And so when we talk about the population and how much it can hold on to, we will use the word sustain. So, we talked a little bit about farming. You might have, let's say, 100 goats living in a football field, but is that sustainable? Probably not, because you need that soil and you need those plants to regenerate. You need watering, those types of things. And so that's kind of one of the factors that we'll talk about, is that there's a human aspect to this with agriculture as well. So first of all, let's talk about the different ways that populations space themselves in their environment. We classify them into 3 different categories, and these have different names. So the first picture you're seeing there is what we call clumped. Sometimes that's called aggregated. Sometimes it's called grouped. But those are like colonial creatures. So those would be like packs of wolves, troops of chimpanzees, hives of bees, colonies of ants. Uniform is one that we see a little bit with plants especially, where there are resources that are even. And so we see these sometimes with like groves of oaks. We see this sometimes with aspen trees. We can see this with penguins that are territorial. We see this with other predatory birds where they need a certain set amount of space in order to survive, or if they're marking or defending their own territory. And then the last one is random. And this is probably the rarest that we see. Now keep in mind that these dispersions, they're called, they can also change based on the season, whether it's mating season, non-mating season, whether resources are scarce, whether they're not scarce, whether a mother has cubs near her or not. And so these can change. They're not set in stone. So if we look at some of the examples that we have in our slideshow here you're seeing a school of fish. You would say that that would be a grouped type. Here, certainly you have a lot of penguins, but if we look within the penguins, we might say that they are a uniform because they're defending nesting sites. And then some of our predatory creatures, for example, this tarantula, they show random, where they, just that. It is random, so it lives up to its name. Another phrase that we use besides density, dispersion, or distribution is population density. So how packed they are together. And a lot of our creatures do have clump type of dispersion, and the reason for that is there's more sets of eyes to look out for predators. We don't have a lot of sole or lone or solitary creatures on Earth. A lot of our creatures are colonial, and the reason for that is because of that protection factor. So if you have an area that has a lot of resources, that means that it can sustain and hold on to a larger population. If resources are scarce, then we don't see a lot of highly population density factors with those. Next one, let's talk about, so this kind of reiterates what I just talked about. So what makes population size high or low? It's all those resources that they have. How do you figure out how many creatures are in an area? There's a lot of different ways that you can measure. So if I said, all right, there's 1.3 million white-tailed deer that live in Minnesota. Well, how do I get that? There's a couple of different techniques. You have what's called the capture and recapture. You can have direct counts, and then you kind of extrapolate based on the area. But oftentimes these things aren't as accurate just because populations are always changing. There's always things that are happening. So speaking of that, if we look at some of those changes in population size and what can all happen, immigration, emigration, moving in, moving out, births and deaths, those of course are some of the factors that really influence the amount that's in that population. So if we take good use population, or if we take any other town's population, and we look at it from the 2015 versus 2010 versus 2005 census, it's going to change quite a bit because of births, deaths, people moving in, people moving out. So this happens not only with towns, but also with all biology. So what scientists initially thought is that populations could go on and on and on and on forever. We know that that's not true because you run out of those vital resources like food, water, space, and shelter. And so depending on what area you're looking at, we can kind of calculate it into what's called biological or biotic potential. And that is taking a look at, all right, if there were ideal conditions, what would be the total area or total amount that this area could sustain? And those collectively are called limiting factors, or also known as density dependent factors. This is an important vocab word to know. So these are resources that if they are in short supply, they are going to alter the population. And so again, it's those basic things: food, water, space, shelter, gas, sunlight, nutrients if we're talking about some plants. And so those will influence that number. And so when we put that onto a graph, instead of it being an exponential type of growth, we see more of what we call a logistic type of growth, where you still have that so the population is starting, it starts off, okay, it's getting used to the area, but then you see a very, very big increase, and there's that exponential type of growth. But instead of going on forever, it will get to this leveling off. And oftentimes, and this is new from what you learned your 10th grade year, but oftentimes that number will overshoot actually, and then it will actually come back to where it is. And there's several reasons for that. Oftentimes, when a creature is introduced to an area, it doesn't have predators, it doesn't have native predators, and so it does really, really well. Well, then once things start to figure out, hey, I can eat this thing, then the population goes down. The other key that we didn't talk a lot about in 10th grade is that we also see this up and downness. It doesn't stay nice and steady like what you're seeing up here. And the reason for that is that's the seasonal change. That's the predator change. That's drought. That's flood. That's a bad year for wind or something like that. That can really change those numbers. Regardless of whether we're talking about a plant, an animal, a predator, or prey, those numbers change. But that carrying capacity is a word that we did talk about last year, but is super important. It's the max that that area can sustain, meaning does it stay healthy? So the whole farming idea, we can pack all the beef cows, all the pigs that we want into a pen, but does that area stay healthy? And that's why we oftentimes need to supplement diets and do those types of things in order to have some of those more dense with agriculture, dense situations. All right, so that overshooting capacity, it's temporary, and the reason for that is because there's no predators. They're still trying to figure themselves out, and that oftentimes happens because of there's too many of them, and so you have starvation. You have the competition that's going to take place, and we see that with a case study that was done on what's called St. Matthew's Island. It's a good sounding island with reindeer. And so those are density dependent factors where they have to have them in order to survive. If you have a high population, you're more susceptible to things like disease, competition. You're living in your waste sometimes, and so it can be toxic. You're also going to have parasites because they thrive in those types of environments as well. So those are density dependent factors. They're also known as limiting factors, kind of a bunch of vocab words all rolled into several different names. Not the same are what we call density independent factors. So these are things that are going to cause the population's number to change regardless of what the density is. So the best examples of these are natural disasters. So when we have hurricanes, tornadoes, forest fires, volcanic eruptions, those things don't happen because, oh, there's a population of 1,000 ants, let's have a forest fire. That doesn't happen. These things happen by chance. Sometimes they happen randomly. And the point is that they change the population's number regardless. And so those are what we call density independent factors. So some vocab for our first slideshow here: density dependent factors, logistic growth, carrying capacity, limiting factors, which again are also known as the density dependent factors, biotic potential, exponential growth, and those are some of our vocab words for this first slideshow. And then some review words would be population density, population distribution, also known as dispersion, and those different vocab words that describe them. So that concludes our first introduction to ecology populations.